what it actually means is that every note contains all other notes inside it. It's a beautiful kind of like the Russian doll thing. So you have all the complexity of music contained within a single sound.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of I Know This Guy, the podcast where we dive deep into the lives of some of the most interesting people I know. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to I Know This Guy wherever you get your podcasts. By the way, my kids want me to say something about ringing a bell. What the hell's a bell?
So you're ready for your music lesson today?
I am. I think I'm more ready to get beat up. I'm ready for my music lesson. I know nothing about music, although I love music.
Right. Well, you're in for a treat then.
And we've got so many world-class musicians on this show. And yeah, it was like when I was talking with Leo Rossi the other day and Joe Pistone, the real Donnie Brasco. What do I know about wise guys? And it's the same thing, but anyways, you throw me into an interview with Julian Joseph and it was awesome. I mean, just an incredible, interesting guy. And he refers, Matthew Barley, and just another great guy.
Even the way we navigate the interview too, you can tell he's really passionate about education and can really break down really complex ideas.
Okay, you can say it.
Understand. Well, I understand.
No, you can say it about the complex, things about music down. You can say it, dumbing it down for your dad.
That's right.
There you go.
That could be our next podcast.
There you go.
Anyway, let's get into this one. I'm really excited.
All right. I'm looking forward to it. All right, Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Norm. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, Julian Joseph had a lot of good things to say.
Julian's been like a brother to me for over 20 years, I would say. We've done a lot of music making together, a lot of touring around the world, a lot of planes and concert halls.
Yeah, it was really interesting talking with him. He's just a nice guy. Interesting and just a nice guy. I could have talked with him for another hour.
Yeah, he's a very, very nice guy. He's also got a fabulous radio voice. He is a really extraordinary musician. Once you start talking to him, as I'm sure you found out, his knowledge of the jazz world going way back to the beginning is really extraordinary.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that he has fabulous voice for radio. I've been told I have a very good face for radio. So, so why don't we just get right into it? I'm very interested in your backstory, and I wanted to know basically what makes Matthew Matthew.
I'd love to know that too. Well, I suppose musically speaking, in some ways I benefited from not being too hot-housed in the early years. So I grew up in Sheffield, which is a city in the north of England. It was a city that had a fantastic local music provision at the time. So I had free cello lessons and access to all sorts of ensembles and orchestras. I was not pushed. I was allowed to just take things at my own pace. And I suppose the first big step was when I joined the National Youth Orchestra. Aged 14, suddenly I met all these incredible young musicians from all around the country. And something was really lit in me at that point. Something was galvanized. And I thought, wow, this is an extraordinary medium that I was in love with so much. And from there, I applied to go to a music school, Cheetham School of Music in Manchester. And then in London, a couple of years later, aged 18, the Guildhall School, and then Moscow Conservatoire for a postgraduate study. But I think I remember the first gig I ever went to. It was a band called Black Stallion, and they were a reggae band. It was in a little town called Hebden Bridge, also in the north of England. And I remember after that concert just thinking, whoa, I want to be a reggae cellist. And looking back on that, I loved the sort of innocence of that. But I suppose what's important for me to draw from that, for understanding how I came who I am musically, is that I didn't have any voice inside that said, oh, you can't be a reggae cellist. There's no such thing, even though there may well be no such thing. But I always just loved many, many different kinds of music. I was exposed to many different kinds of music. And my basic rule was that if I really loved it, I wanted to play it somehow, whether that meant arranging or working with different kinds of musicians from different places. So I never had this idea that classical music is classical music and you shouldn't stray out of those boundaries.
Now, let's go back to the earlier, let's say, I'm not sure if it's called this in England, but elementary school. Like, was there anybody who you were looking towards or a teacher that got you interested in music?
Well, the story is I started to play the piano when I was 5, and I had 6 piano lessons. And then in great frustration, my teacher called my parents and said, "I'm ever so sorry, your son is completely unmusical. You're wasting your money." So my first musical career was cut short. And I do have a memory of those lessons, and I do have a memory of playing. I had to learn notation, obviously, at the same time as learning the piano. And I had to play words that could be spelt from the first 7 letters of the alphabet. So I remember playing the word bag, and I remember playing the word cabbage. And none of these things really put me on fire. So that was the end of that, really. And I don't think, my parents were just like good middle-class parents trying things out for their kids. But then when I was 7, I heard somebody play the cello, and I don't remember this, but I said to my parents, that's what I want to do. That's what I really loved. So I think it was the sound, I'm presuming it was the sound of the cello that really got to me. And still, that's my number one thing with the cello, is the sound that you can create. That wonderful, very human, very accessible sound was, I think, what got into my ears and my heart then.
And in high school, there was a music department that you were talking about. First of all, most important question, is it called high school?
Secondary school.
Secondary school. Okay, so in secondary school.
Yeah.
All right. I know, Hayden, tell me if this is the same in Canada, but I know when I was going to secondary school, we did not have anything like that. We might have had a guitar or drums, but no cellos whatsoever. With Hayden, with you at Alliston Union, did you have anything like that?
Not at Alliston Union, but once I got around the age of 14, like our grade 9, we go to high school, and we had a broken down music department at that high school, where like literally the tubas and all the brass instruments were dented and like rusted. Yes. And it wasn't until maybe there was a new teacher that came in and kind of revamped the program as I was there, which is partially why I got into music in the first place. But yeah, just like it was a sad scene.
We were very lucky. I mean, we had a full symphony orchestra at secondary school.
What?
With pretty much all the instruments, from what I remember. I think there were maybe 6 cellos in it or something. So I remember having school orchestra on Monday night, and I think it was a recorder consort I played in on Tuesday night. And then another orchestra, the Friday night orchestra, we called it on Friday nights. And then on Saturday, what was called the Sheffield Youth Orchestra. So I was just playing in ensembles all the time and absolutely loved it. But that was really where that love of making music with other people came in.
Wow, that's fantastic.
It's incredible, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and was that similar throughout England, or was that
Absolutely. Yeah.
It was all over?
It was all over England, and every county, I mean, I guess there are sort of 40 counties in the country or something. Every county had a county youth orchestra, and they were all the sort of feeder orchestras that went into the National Youth Orchestra. So really music making in teenage to 21 or something was of a very, very high standard. And since, I guess it's since the 80s, I think it's Margaret Thatcher that really began to dismantle the budgets for local councils. And that's when the youth orchestra started to suffer. And they've been fighting a losing battle ever since. But it was in the 70s, it was quite something.
Music is so important, especially, when you're growing up. It's, again, I'll just refer back to Hayden, but also learning a second language and music and yes, sports, all of these things together really help develop, a human being.
Absolutely. I was reading something very interesting the other day, Norm. Somebody was saying that really life gets very interesting when we engage with its complexity. And obviously that one of the greatest examples of complexity in the universe we know of is the human brain. And it's through arts and sports to some degree that you really manage to grapple with complexity. Like if you're playing a cello or any instrument really, but I'll take the cello as an example, you've got to think about the fact that your hands are doing two entirely different things. So the two hemispheres of your brain are engaged in very different things just on a physical level. You also have to engage emotionally. You also have to have your eye on what you're communicating to an audience. You have to remember all those notes, and you have to have studied. And I think they've found in neurological studies that there's nothing that uses so many different regions of the brain simultaneously as playing a musical instrument. So it's a wonderful way to grapple with our natural complexity, I think.
Yeah, especially, and I tried to play an instrument and people did not like that. Absolutely did not like. My family didn't like it. Neighbors didn't like it. So I stopped. But what I do know, and when I watch musicians, it's not only the music that they're playing to the audience. Great musicians know how to play to the audience. They can ooze that personality while they're doing all of this.
Yeah.
I have no idea how you can do all this. Like, it's multitasking, really.
It is, yeah. And in a sense, I don't think most musicians know. I don't really know how what is happening, because there's more, I think, than the conscious brain can actually deal with in any one moment. And that you are, like we know from this terminology from sport, especially from tennis players who talk about getting in the zone when the tennis ball appears to be huge and the racket is huge and they just know they can't possibly miss anything. That's not really something that you can get into consciously. It's about surrendering to something.
Were you ever nervous on stage?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. No, I've been through several periods of really, really grappling with stage fright. And so much so in my late 20s that I actually decided to do a parachute jump because I was very curious to know what was more frightening, playing the cello or jumping out of an aeroplane. And the lead up, spiraling around in that plane, climbing up or getting ready to play on stage, playing is more frightening. But actually the second way you jump out of an aeroplane, that's really scary. So I think that just about pips the post. But yeah, I did suffer a lot from stage nerves, and I really only got to grips with that, I think, in my early 30s, where I realized very late on that, in fact, the reason I was getting so nervous was because I was not actually completely prepared. And I changed something about the methods of preparation, which made me much more secure on stage since then.
You played with the National Symphony, is that correct?
The National Youth Orchestra.
National Youth Orchestra,
right, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
What did you do after that?
Well, then I went to Cheetham School of Music, which was the beginning of my sort of full-time musical training. And I had 2 very happy years there. And then a bunch of us decided we wanted to audition for a London college, go down to London, see what the big city was like and the teachers there. And 4 years at the Guildhall School were really, really wonderful. And then I played in a piece written by Leonard Bernstein called Mass, and there was a big cello solo in that, which I was very lucky to play, and I really loved playing it. And Bernstein was incredibly enthusiastic about the way I played it. He gave me a scholarship to come and study at his expense in the States for 9 weeks at the Tanglewood Music Festival near Boston. And that was a real life changer. I remember it was the time when I was thinking, okay, should I go and do a postgraduate study after the Guildhall? Should I go to Germany or Holland or Russia or America? So I was just trying to figure out, what's the next stage. One of our projects was playing with a Russian conductor called Gennady Rozhdestvensky. And we were playing a piece by Shostakovich, the 10th Symphony. And I was just blown away by the Russianness of it all. And I remember sitting in a rehearsal and just thinking, I'm going to go and study in Russia. Whatever happens, I'm going to Russia. And I got myself a British Council scholarship and spent 2 years in Moscow at the conservatoire there, which was just a really extraordinary time. It was 87 to 89, so it was the very tail end of the Soviet Union. It was Gorbachev and Glasnost and Perestroika. The country was opening up, but also by the time I left, there were food shortages, there was unrest on the streets, and it was only, I think, 4 months after I left that the Berlin Wall came down. So it was a very exciting time to be there, and musically, it really set me up. It gave me access to study that incredible Russian school of string playing, which is such a strong thing over the last century. So that was the next steps.
So Matthew, I just heard you talk about the Russian school. What's the difference between sort of the English school or, from England over to the United States? What's the difference?
I'll give you a roundabout answer by way of a little anecdote, which is that after I was in Moscow for a couple of months or something, we heard that there was some wine on sale in the local supermarket. Now, that's a very, very unusual occurrence in late Soviet era. And something that I'd been accustomed to all through my studies in Guildhall was that a bunch of us, every now and then, we would get together, we'd sit around, 4 or 5 of us, and we'd play chamber music in the evenings and drink a bottle of wine because we loved music. It was just for fun. So I remember saying to some Russian friends, hey, should we go and try and buy a bottle of wine and read through some Beethoven string quartets? And I'll never forget it. They just looked at me and they went, why? And it was an extraordinary moment because it was so not the response I was expecting. But what I understood was music making in England is essentially an amateur tradition. We get together, we make music for fun. And obviously there's a very strong professional side to it, but they are the roots of music making in England. Whereas in Russia, it's deadly serious. And the Russians applied themselves to the business of playing an instrument in the same way that they did to the business of winning medals at the Olympics or training chess players. And in fact, cut me off if I'm going on for too long, but my wife's is also a musician. She's a Russian violinist, and she very well illustrates, her life illustrates the sort of deadly seriousness of playing music. She won the biggest music competition in the world, the Tchaikovsky competition, the gold medal in, I think, 82. And about a year after that, she defected to the West through Finland. And it was winning that competition that allowed her to defect and create a whole new life for herself. If she had won the silver medal, she wouldn't have been able to defect because she wouldn't have got the engagement outside of Russia with only a silver medal. It was only the gold medal that gave you that possibility. So everybody wanted to win the competitions. It was the whole system of music making in Russia was about training up the individual to win competitions. And if 999 musicians failed, they were emotional wrecks and they had awful lives after that. But one person won the gold medal, that's fine. That justifies the system. So that's a way of explaining the Russian school. I think first and foremost, you've got to understand that it was an extremely serious matter. So when kids were starting to play, and again, my wife's a good example, she played from the age of 4, nobody would have mentioned, I can guarantee you ever, whether or not she was having fun. That was utterly irrelevant. It was all about placing the fingers in exactly the right place, making the right sound, doing the right amount of study. Her father went to her music lessons and came in and practiced with her 2 hours a day. Whereas I was enjoying playing in all my local youth orchestras and staring at all the beautiful girls in the violin section. So arguably, I had a much more fun childhood than my wife, but it's that seriousness that creates absolutely extraordinary players. And then, so I'm giving you that as the sort of human background to the Russian school, but then in very technical terms and sound terms, if you can imagine you're drawing a bow, which has got horsehair on it, so it's slightly rough under a microscope. It's got lots of tiny little bits coming off it. You're drawing a horsehair bow over a steel string to make that string vibrate. And you can imagine if you draw it over very lightly, you'll get one kind of sound, as a type of sound. And if you really apply a lot of weight and pressure, you'll get a much more warm and deep and plummy sound. And the Russian school is very much about getting that power into the string and making a strong sound. And then I'm getting pretty technical here, but I think it's...
No, I love it.
You're able to follow. Okay, great. So with the left hand, basically, the left hand stops the string, plays the different notes, and we oscillate our hand in order to create I can't sing at all, but I'll try for the sake of illustration. La is a note without vibrato. And then if I vibrate, it's la. What a terrible sound. But anyway, you get the idea. It's the oscillation of this hand that creates this singing, wobbling sound. And with that, you can create the illusion that you're singing. And the Russian school is all about trying to make a stringed instrument sound like a beautiful voice.
While you were talking about that, I remember my son was playing hockey, not Hayden. This was Kels. And we played against the Russian national team. And as you're describing this, I'm thinking of that team. Very, very disciplined, no fun. It's all about the game and all about being as disciplined as can be. I remember watching the coach and I just went, this guy's going to die on the bench. He was so stressed out.
It's a serious business.
Yeah. So I watched this guy, especially when the team, Kelsey's team, sort of caught up and then went on to win. I thought this guy was going to have a heart attack. And the whole team, like, it was just, they were having no fun. Complete discipline. Yeah. So when you were talking about your wife and, coming in and getting the gold and then the silver, completely understand that. But as it applies to sport.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a thing about Russia, and they are able to produce people who do things very well.
Okay, Hayden, do you have any questions?
Actually, like kind of along these lines, I mean, I know we touched on stage fright and overcoming that, but I feel like having that super serious upbringing must, like, for your wife, must have caused some, or like, I don't know if you, like, just through training you would fight through any stage nerves, but like, I'm curious in the way you both handle performance and like the mental game of performance. Like, are there any differences between you two?
There are differences, yeah. And I think actually on this genuinely interesting subject, it's worth saying that there is one school of Buddhism that talks about the necessity of overcoming the 5 cardinal fears before you can attain enlightenment. And, there are sort of predictable ones like the fear of death or the fear of the unknown. But one of them is the fear of public speaking. And this is, from some Buddhist tract over 2,000 years old or something. And from that, we can learn that obviously standing up and performing in some way before other people, it's a really big deal for human beings. So even if you're the best prepared in the world, I think there's still a big element of nerves when you get up and do stuff in front of other people. If you've really got that preparation under control, then the chances are that your body is going to come to your rescue during the performance, even if you're really scared. And I would say nowadays, because I haven't really suffered too much from nerves for 20 years or something, and the best performances are the ones where you're totally prepared, you've done everything you want to, you are really nervous beforehand, but the minute you start playing, you're in the music, you know what you're doing, you've got your preparation, and it just goes smoothly. But I think it's a genuinely big thing. You go out there and you do something different in front of a lot of people. There's a lot of pressure. Very often in the classical music world, of course, people know the pieces we're playing. They know every note we're trying to play. So there is a lot of pressure for sure.
And you mentioned changing your regimen or your preparation before these. Like, was there anything specific that kind of clicked and you noticed a difference, or like what was that switch for you?
It's a good question. Yeah. So I was basically a talented kid, and I think especially in England, in the sort of musical world that I grew up in, talent was very, very highly prized. Whereas I've come to feel now that actually talent is one of the least important factors in a musician's development. Of course, you need a bit of talent, but in my experience, human beings just are talented. It's a talented species. And what makes the difference is the hard work. And I would prepare a piece, and I would just really enjoy the fact that I could get the whole piece memorized in a couple of days. I could really get my head and my heart, my fingers around it in really just a few days' time, which was very quick. But so I often used to think I could get things to 9 out of 10 faster than any of my peers. And I was really proud of myself for that. But getting it to 10 out of 10 was the thing that I never did because I was lazy. And one thing I noticed with my wife is that she would always begin at the beginning of her practice session. She would always start straight away with the very hardest passages. Whereas I would start off just playing, having a nice time and putting the tricky bits to the end. And it was that real sort of uncompromising, like, this is the hard bit. I'm going to start with it. I'm going to nail it first. So I think there was a shift of perspective there, which was less about having fun and more about just really, tidying up the kitchen.
Did you ever go back and forth with your wife about who's doing it the right way?
No, she was doing it the right way.
Okay. But I agree with my wife all the time too, by the way.
we've had a really, really interesting, we've been together 25 years and we've had a very interesting kind of musical dialogue that whole time, which is actually how I met Julian. So in, I think, 98 or something, I was very struck by the fact that while my wife, Vika is her name, Victoria Mulova, while she only played classical music and very, very the core classical music of the repertoire. But she loved to listen to Beatles, Bee Gees, Yusundur, you name it, all sorts of non-classical music. So I thought, it'd be kind of fun to make some arrangements for her of all this music that she could play on the violin. And so I got together a whole album of all sorts of different things, and I wanted a jazz pianist to work with. But I wanted a jazz pianist who had a really, really well-cultured sound. And that's how we came across Julian, because I think one of the things that Julian does is he plays right, as the Russians would say, he plays to the bottom of the key bed on the piano. He really makes a good sound. He's a big guy. He's got these incredible hands. So, yeah, I remember meeting Julian in 98 or 99 or something to just have a preliminary interview about whether he wanted to take part in this project. He was perfect. So we did this album together with a couple of other musicians as well, called Through the Looking Glass. And I think we played about 30 gigs or something around the world and recorded it. And that was the beginning of a lot of different collaborations with my wife, where I brought in the more kind of non-classical, the more improvisatory approach to making music, and she brought in that incredible kind of Russian solid technique side, and we've really enjoyed the collaborations over the years.
It's great that you could do something like that.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Really good fun.
Yeah. Again, here we go. Here's my ignorance. But classical music seems to have a stigma about being based around reading music. When did you break away from this?
I think actually the very first time there was an album called Variations, and it was Julian Lloyd Webber, who is the brother of Andrew Lloyd Webber, as in Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita and so on. And Julian was a very fine cellist. He's retired now. But he did this album with a rock band behind him of all these different variations on a Paganini theme. And I thought it was just amazing. And I learned to play a lot of that by ear just from the record. And I think that was my first taste of a different kind of music making. And then it wasn't till many years later, actually, I was at the Guildhall School, that I started to improvise. And that was really, that's probably one of the sort of watershed moments of my musical life, was discovering that joy of making music without things on the written page. And I mean, it is a problem because, of course, in classical music, everything is notated and you can't play it really unless you learn to read the music. And there are many, many ways of making music that don't require you to read music. And of course, my favorite example is going to be the Beatles. None of them could read music, which in fact led to a really funny story. A friend of mine, a very dear friend who's died now, is John Lord, who is the keyboard player in Deep Purple. We did a few projects together. And around about that time, Paul McCartney was writing a piece called the Oratorio for the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic, I think. But Paul couldn't read music, which is pretty tricky if you're going to write a piece for an orchestra. And he was slaving away. And at one point, he called up John Lord for some advice, because John was very musically literate. And they were chatting away. And eventually, Paul just said, "Well, you see, John, the thing is, I can do everything except the fucking notes." Which was a lovely, lovely insight. I can do everything. Anyway, I don't know if we're allowed to swear on this program, but
you can do anything you want.
Okay, great. And I think, what, in a way, that illustrates something nice. Really, reading music it's just a means to an end. That's all it is. The real heart of making music and playing music is nothing to do with reading it at all. It's something much more direct and from the body to another pair of ears.
It's interesting that you say that, because even that story you said about Paul McCartney, I look at Frank Zappa. He's the same. He doesn't know how to read or write music. Well, he knows how to write music, but how do you do it? How do you all of a sudden go from nothing and get an orchestra? I don't know. It boggles my mind.
Yeah.
It's not like well, I guess music is like a different language, but how can you just translate it from a thought to all these musicians?
Yeah. I think in the end, Paul McCartney worked with an assistant who actually got his idea. So Paul would play stuff with the guitar, sing stuff, and the assistant would actually get it down onto paper in order to communicate that to the others. But by far the oldest way of making music is just people get in a room together and they do stuff, or sit under a tree in the midday shade or something. And notation didn't come along until about the 8th century. People were making music for sure a very long way before that. And it would have always just happened, like somebody plays something, the other person copies it, and then the other person makes a little bit of a variation, and the first one goes, "Oh, that's nice, I want to learn that too." And it's a conversation, I guess.
Kind of curious, what was the first recorded song written? I wonder if,
It's a good story.
Yeah.
It's a good story. And I can't remember the exact pope, but I think it was Pope Gregory, either the 6th or the 8th. And what happened was that he was finding that the Roman Catholic priests who would always sing in the service, they were bringing too many different kinds of music, influences from different places into the service. And the Pope decided that they needed to actually find a way of ordering what music was allowed to happen and what wasn't. So that was when notation was invented, and it was a very, very simple kind of notation, which is, it's even quite hard to recognize on the paper that it's related to today's. And I love this story because really it means that notation was invented in order to stamp out improvisation. It was a method of control to stop musicians making things up. But what's wonderful is that he got there just a little bit too late. And I think in the Roman Catholic, I don't know, what do you call it? The Roman Catholic songbook, or whatever manuscript it is where all of these things are written down, you can find traces of Syrian folk song in those Roman Catholic canticles that they were singing, which are almost like they got fossilized in there before, it was a little bit too late that the notation came along. Wow. It's good, isn't it?
Yeah. Incredible. Are you seeing a shift in classical music education today?
Definitely, yeah. I mentioned when I began improvising at the Guildhall, which was a very, very exciting moment for me. I did a module in my course called Music, Performance and Communication Skills. And it was very, very forward-thinking at the time. We learned a bit of improvisation. We did a project in a primary school and one in a prison and one in a hospice with dying patients. And it was all about trying to change the classical music model from being something where we would prepare, a sort of metaphorical portfolio of Beethoven and Bach and Mozart, and then we would just take that around the world and play it to whoever was interested. Turning that on its head and saying, okay, I'm a musician, I'm going out into the community, whether it's a primary school or a hospice or a prison, I'm going to engage with people, I'm going to find out, what do you want to listen to? What's going to light up your world? What kind of music? And so we really engaged in very interesting two-way projects and came up with musical material, sometimes arrangements of things. And one of the things that pops into my head, which was very moving, was in one of the patients in the hospice, a lady in her 80s who could remember some music hall songs from her childhood in London in the 30s, I think it was, 20s or 30s. And she sung us these songs and we made arrangements of them for her on our instruments. And it was just magical. And we never would have got that connection had we just gone in and said, okay, here's some Mozart for you. And so we were arranging, we were improvising, we were engaging with music from many, many different cultures. And it was like a big revolution happened at the Guildhall School in those days. And I thought, obviously, everybody's going to love this. Everybody's going to want to do this because it makes so much sense. The whole music world is going to be changed in 5 or 10 years. And I was right and I was wrong. The music world has been changing, but it took way longer than 5 or 10 years. But you do now find that classical musicians a lot of them are improvising, a lot of them are engaging with musicians from many, many different backgrounds. And I think the whole world of classical music is really opening up. It's looking much more outward than it used to do from its place of sort of elite insularity.
I'm from more of the e-com world, business world, and mentorship. We preach networking and mentorship, right, especially to younger people coming into the e-com community. Mm-hmm. What about in music? What's the importance of mentorship in music, and especially with youth?
Yeah, well, that's traditionally has always been the way that music was passed from one generation to another. And you don't really find that so much in the classical world anymore, except in the actual relationship between the student and their teacher. So at Guildhall, I had orchestras, ensembles, I had music appreciation classes, music harmony classes, and so on and so forth. But the center of my musical world was my cello lessons. Twice a week with my wonderful teacher, Stefan Popov, from Bulgaria. We would sit in our room for 1 or 2 hours and he would just teach me everything he knew. And that sense of mentorship was incredibly important to me because it wasn't just learning about music. I would understand from him his approach to life, his approach to other people. We would sometimes talk about religion or politics and all sorts of things. So that was incredibly important to me. And I think it's even more pronounced in India, in the India classical music world. They have this, they call it the Guru Shishya relationship, which is really intense. I mean, that can go on for many, many years, but that mentorship is absolutely central.
Going back to the business side or the e-com side, we always preach to go and find somebody with your personality. So for me, it would be that my personality of doing business. What about with finding somebody to mentoring you on the music side of things? How do you go about doing that? Is it finding somebody with your own style of music or?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Russian school about how important sound was. And that would really be, when you're thinking, who do I want to study with? It's about who makes the sound that you want to make. I mean, it probably, from someone who's not in the classical music world, I would imagine people just think, violin, violin sounds like a violin. But anybody would hear, if I was to take 2 different recordings of very famous violinists and I can say, okay, this plays it like this and this plays it like this, you would hear the difference. There are huge differences. And connecting with a sound is the most important thing. If you're going to learn with someone, you've got to really understand and love that school of sound.
I also think, a lot of people don't know what goes into, crafting your own sound on your instrument, like, especially for classical string players. Like I hear about the practice routine that's involved, or the amount of listening you have to do. Like, can you talk a little bit about that process? Like, I don't think the average person really
about the practice
knows.
routine.
Practice, or developing that sound, like you mentioned, like finding a mentor with a sound that speaks to you. But how have you crafted your own sound on the instrument?
So, I mean, that's also a very mysterious question, actually, because although there are certain parameters like Russian school, I mean, I can hear if someone studied in Russia or with a Russian teacher. But there's another level, which is just, in the end, the sound is just an individual extension. And I don't really know, because I know that I developed my sound so much over the last 20 years. It's a really, really good question. And I think while I'm sitting and practicing, there's that constant feedback loop, which is I hear a sound in my head, I can imagine a phrase, I know what I want it to sound like, and I put my bow on the string and I play something, and I try, the work is to try and match the sound that's coming out of the cello to the sound that I can hear in my head. So in the end, it is an extremely individual thing. And I guess just years, the 10,000 hours, forget it, it's 30,000 hours or whatever it is. But, that constant going round and round and round, is that how I want it to sound? No, a little bit more of this here or a little bit step back here. And it comes over many, many years, but I think it's a very mysterious process. It's hard to really teach that.
I feel like it's something, like you mentioned, it's also ever evolving. Like, for me personally, like if I listen to a recording of a certain player, I'm like, oh, I could maybe take a little bit of that and try and get it to come out on my instrument.
Exactly. And what I find happens is that, you hear something that inspires you and it's, I'd really like to make it sound like that. And off you go with your practice. But quite soon you're on your own exploration. And you may actually end up with something that sounded quite different from what you were aiming for at the beginning. But it's that process of constantly feeding back, like, is it sounding like I want it to, that gets you where you want to get to.
So we watched a bit about your TED Talks. It was great. It was an incredible example of taking complex musical ideas and breaking it down so even I could understand it. So
fantastic.
But do you want to talk a little bit about that, about the ability, or just giving us some examples like you did in the TED Talks?
TED Talk. I mean, that's a really wonderful area for me. It's where music can almost become quite mystical. I mean, I think music it is a mystical force human beings have there, but it's also something. Sound obviously exists independent of music. Sound exists independent of human beings, and many many sort of creation myths from around the world have sound at their very, very center. In the beginning, there was Om, for the Hindu in their creation myth. Everything began with sound. And every sound, no matter what it is, whether it's a beautifully drawn note on the cello, or whether it's a bit of bird song, or whether it's a clap of thunder, every sound is created up of harmonics. And this is the bit that's always very, very hard to describe without actually an instrument in my hand. But basically, if you analyze a sound, you can see that it has lots of layers of notes. It's not just one single sound on its own. And it's the different layers of notes that are above it that you don't necessarily hear primarily. Like if I sing la, the note you're hearing is la, but it also contains la, much, much quieter in that original la. So it contains a whole pile of different notes which are above it, which we don't hear. We only hear the primary sound, but it's all those different notes above it that give it its color, its timbre. And what it actually means is that every note contains all other notes inside it. It's a beautiful kind of like the Russian doll thing. So you have all the complexity of music contained within a single sound.
Thanks for listening, guys and gals. That concludes part 1 of our interview with Matthew Barley. Make sure to tune in later in the week to hear the rest of the interview. As always, make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else, so we're only ever one search bar away. That's enough for me, and I'll see you next time.